My name is Stuart Raphael. On the night of August 10th, 1979, a man living in Bonaparte, Florida, was awakened in the middle of the night by the piercing screams of a child coming from outside his house on a quiet road. He bolted out of bed and ran instinctively to his front door and out into his yard, mortified and ready to help. The moment he got to the edge of his lawn, though, the screaming, which he would identify as that of a boy, stopped. He looked up and down the road. It was only a little past 12, but no neighbors seemed to be awake in his upper-middle-class neighborhood. The houses on his side of the road faced a very small, nondescript public park which bordered a quiet lake on its other side. Monkey bars, a sliding board, a few benches looking out over the water. He crossed the road, believing someone in Starling Park had been the source of that terrible sound. He saw that the park's most well-known feature, a modest foot-propelled carousel consisting of 4 tiny horses on a creaky metal platform, was slowly spinning, though no child was in sight. As he approached, the carousel slowed and slowed, then finally stopped. The horses stared blankly into the dark, their paint faded and chipped, one of them a little wobbly, an amusement to be replaced sometime with something more modern. The man who heard the screams returned to his house and called the police, though nothing out of the ordinary was discovered that night. Just 8 hours later, a woman with the interesting name of Wanda Windows was sitting on one of Starling Park's 2 benches under a cloudy sky, reading a novel before reporting to her shift at a Ponderosa steakhouse. She glanced up to see a small boy of perhaps 8 approaching the park from down the road. As he got closer, she noticed he was dressed in a suit, as if he were off to attend a formal gathering. But the suit was very rumpled and terribly dirt-stained. His blonde hair was askew. He entered the park and approached Wanda. She offered him a concerned smile and was about to ask him if he was all right when she suddenly felt cold all over. The boy said to her, "Why didn't you help me off the merry-go-round last night?" Before she could even offer a confused reply, he added this, "Why didn't you come to my funeral this morning?" The last thing Wanda Windows remembered was the image of a large red and black burn on the boy's left cheek, and then she simply lost consciousness for several minutes. Later she would tell people she woke on her back in the grass nearby, looking up at the ominous clouds above, and she began to shake all over, and could not stop until she got back to her house to call out sick at work. What I've just described is, as far as I or anyone can tell, the most likely origin of the local Bonaparte legend referred to as the Spinning Boy. From these alleged facts, none of which can to this day be completely proven, emerged a long line of embellishments and modifications to the tale, and they've stretched to the present day. The Spinning Boy has lived in the consciousness of 2 generations, persistent in the town's oral history, as well as becoming a go-to motif for Halloween haunted houses and hastily published collections of urban legends. On June 21st of this year, I drove to Bonaparte to spend one day researching what I had not been able to find out otherwise. The town has one respectable bed and breakfast called Ivy Lock, and that's where I arrived on a deathly hot night of thunderstorms and loud crashes of lightning. I splashed through growing puddles to the covered front porch, and as I waited for someone to answer the bell, I was served with my first frightening moment of my journey. Looking up at a high window, I saw the contours of a face, looking out from a room lit only by a pale orange glow. That face, motionless, strangely blank, seemed to have no eyes. No eyes at all. The door opened, startling me. David, the co-owner of the B&B, greeted me cheerfully. He was a retired engineer who had bought the place with his wife Deborah, a chef 18 years before. I said nothing about the face in the window as he gave me the lay of the land and led me upstairs to my small room. I asked him if he and his wife lived here alone. He said yes, they did. Any other guests here tonight? No. Oh, he added, except for the girls. Let me introduce you. We went down the hall and he opened the door to a large bedroom that had been converted into a sitting parlor. Beside the window sat a mannequin, positioned at an antique spinning wheel. The mannequin was dressed in colonial clothing, hands positioned at the wheel in mid-creation, though that thing likely hadn't rotated in more than 100 years. The mannequin's face was virtually featureless, of truly vintage design, gray and pale. This was Miriam, I was told, bought from an antique dealer in 1941 by owners of the house now long dead. Once, long ago, metal rods, if activated, would make the wheel turn and make Miriam's hands move on it in a primitive way. Her head, draped in bobbed black hair, was craned to gaze out the upper window as she worked. Across the room, in front of a fireplace, stood Judy, manufactured in the late 1890s, 5 feet tall, wearing a very large hoop skirt. Her own face was completely smooth. A dark brown wig was the only indication of her humanity. She leaned forward slightly at the waist, and her own set of supporting and cleverly hidden metal rods would, if she were operational, cause her to push an iron poker into the fireplace to occasionally stir whatever ashes lay within. The fireplace itself hadn't been used for 20 years. The girls added a bit of rustic charm to the place, David told me. You've probably never heard of the legend of the spinning boy, he said, taking me completely off guard. I told him I had several times. He smiled humbly and confessed that on the website advertising the B&B, he and his wife had once guiltily fabricated some story about how the ghost snuck into the house each August 10th and caused the spinning wheel to suddenly rotate in the middle of the night. Because that was during the period when the tiny carousel where he'd allegedly died or disappeared had been removed from Starling Park. And the antique in this very room was the thing then that moved in circles and fascinated him. All nonsense, David admitted, but they'd been convinced by a friend that a ghost story would bring in a little more business. I smiled and changed the topic. So many versions of the story had emerged since 1979. Depending on who you talked to in Bonaparte, or which clumsy and tainted oral history you entertained, people would sometimes see the boy walking down Canal Road in a daze and wearing his funeral suit. Or the carousel, before it had been removed for reasons unknown in 1988, would spin by itself on hot nights. The origin of the little boy's burn, the one Wanda Windows had claimed she'd seen on his cheek, was eventually focused on the most obvious possibility. Since the park's construction, there had been a sign posted in it that warned parents and children that the metal and iron of the playground equipment could become extremely hot to the touch. This was true. As a child who had spent 4 years right here in Bonaparte before moving north with my family, and who had been in 3rd grade in 1979, I could attest to more than a few painful moments of suddenly touching the wrong rung or monkey bar when the temperature reached 100. The chain links and the swings were brutal on the hands. If a little boy had in fact been riding the carousel at night, Then, of course, it was totally unlikely that he would have been scorched by either the horses themselves or the little metal rods that protruded from the sides of their heads. But, of course, an urban legend doesn't apply logic to itself. And so that boy had screamed and screamed upon somehow getting his face stuck against hot metal until his cheek had been indelibly branded. After breakfast at the B&B on Sunday, I drove around the town where I'd lived between the ages of 8 and 11. I hadn't been back since then. My therapist told me I might not feel any sense of strain or anxiety at first, but that it might grip me a little more with each familiar sight. But I was okay. This is going to work, I thought. A line of aggressive rainstorms had gripped the entire region, and they would not let go. I found that Redbird's, a local breakfast and lunch dive my sister and I used to be taken to as a treat on Sundays, was still going strong, and I took a table in the corner. I was waited on by one of the skinniest teenagers I'd ever seen, a kind of nerdy kid named Mickey, who seemed a little scared of the customers, including me. But he warmed up to me the more I talked to him about the town, pretending I was new here. Did he know about the spinning boy? I asked. He nodded, tried to sort out in his mind which tale I was talking about. He briefly got it confused with the story of something called Crybaby Bridge out in Pennyfar, but then he was able to explain it to me, stopping himself once in the middle to marvel at how hard the rain was coming down outside. Years ago, he said, some kid had gotten flattened beneath the little carousel in Starling Park. The structure had just fallen on him. They'd taken the carousel away, and sometimes people saw the child walking down near the historic mill on the edge of town, holding his head and moaning, dressed in torn pajamas. What about his face? I asked. And Mickey shrugged, and he said he didn't know much about that. Maybe something about the devil painting a V on his cheek as a warning? V for vile, they said. Yeah. It wasn't a very scary legend, and he suggested if I was here in October that I go to Cheatham's Haunted Village, an attraction built at the old minimum security prison on Kings Avenue, because that was scary. 6 blocks over at Walpole's Rummage, a huge thrift shop that drew people in from all over, I had significantly more trouble finding someone who was willing to discuss the spinning boy, because the chatter was all about the tropical storm that was now officially headed our way, with Bonaparte, Pennyfar, and Stockley being its central target, having veered dramatically off course just in the last 12 hours, headed deeply inland. The town was preparing now for the kind of rain it hadn't seen in 10, 15 years. There was both fear and a twisted sort of mirth running through it, the fear and excitement over something big and different coming. But I spotted someone in the used books aisle who seemed promising, a pretty woman of about my age, but who was much more fit. She was reading a page in a collection of poetry very intently. Her name was Nadine. Initially, I thought I was out of luck, since she told me she was from New York and was just roaming the area during an off day at a screenwriter's retreat. But she knew about the spinning boy from reading small-town legends when she had once outlined a horror novel. She'd been under the impression the tale dated back to the 1890s. The young town of Bonaparte had supposedly been delighted to be given the carousel as a gift from a wealthy industrialist. He'd been traveling through and become aghast that the local children, of whom there were only about 12 at the time, had so few places to play. Starling Park itself had been built around the little thing in a burst of inspiration. But on the very first night, a small boy who had been playing there all day snuck out of his house to return to the carousel, unable to resist it. And he had pushed it around and around by himself, and hopped on at high speed, and slipped, and gotten his head caught somehow, dragged in an agonizing circle, unable to breathe, until he died. He'd been buried underneath the carousel as a tribute. And to this day, he sometimes returned to it, dressed in his burial clothes. His face had been scratched very badly in the accident, especially on his left cheek, with a terrible scar in the shape of a V corrupting his angelic appearance. Nadine said she was actually planning on swinging by Starling Park on her way out of town to grab a photo of the spot, if the rain ever let up. The carousel had been restored to its original spot in 2004, dug out of storage by some planning committee for reasons as mysterious as why it was removed to begin with. Who knew where it had been? Nadine was very nice, but human contact beyond my own instigation has always been too much for me, and I decided not to join her. I would wait to return to the park. It was 2 miles to the community of Butterfield, my old neighborhood. My memories were not many, since it had been a fairly brief stay, despite my parents' desire to put down roots. That plan had gotten delayed by just 1 more year, and those roots were put down in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania instead. Wipers fighting the growing torrent of rain, my Honda Civic splashed along bumpy White Finch Lane to number 416. I shut off the engine and sat at the curb, waiting to feel something. The owners didn't seem to be home. The house was smaller than I remembered, and the big oak tree in the front yard had been cut down. They had to move out of this place because of you, I said to myself coldly, 2 times. A house I might have dwelt in for my high school years. A house my parents might have grown old in, then given to me, or who knows, even my children. But we'd wound up moving north, not a big deal. I just had some problems as a child they hadn't known how to address without some professional help. But eventually I'd gotten through them, and by the age of 14 or so, all that was just a memory. No one had ever been hurt or traumatized. It was just best that they took me out of school, have me homeschooled for a year before the agonies of young adulthood set in. Plenty of kids like that in the world. It made me sad, all the same. It made me feel like I had no real right to be here. Yet at the same time, I had more right than anyone to be here. I remembered a spot I used to like down the road a bit, so I went there. If you cut through the woods off Hopkins Street, you popped out in a place we kids inexplicably called the Pancake. Just a plain field, totally enclosed on all sides by more woods. A big round patch where the ground just hadn't accepted the trees, and grass grew unevenly. People would take their dogs there a lot, and we'd used it for kickball. Huddling under my umbrella, I headed off into the woods, my shoes getting totally muddy, and the Pancake appeared quickly, still undeveloped, deserted on that day. Standing puddles had formed everywhere, some a dozen feet wide. Gentle, inviting pools that were slowly but surely merging as the rain continued to fall. The Pancake would be uncrossable in another couple of hours, and as soon as the rain broke, mosquitoes would be everywhere. There was a little boy on the other side of the field, standing at the edge of the woods. Too young to be out here in the rain alone, I thought. He wore a small blue parka, shorts, and tennis shoes. I couldn't see his face very well. I raised a hand, waved hello. He did not wave back. Instead, he turned away and began to walk slowly into the trees and out of sight. I walked directly forward, crossing the Pancake, my shoes sinking deep into the spongy earth. I tried my best to avoid all the puddles, all the lakes, but in the end my socks were completely soaked. The ground was so marshy I had to be careful not to slip and fall. I entered the trees on the far side, walked down the skinny path I remembered, but maneuvering along its sides, trying to keep out of the mud. The woods ended at Bell Street, a very quiet, wooded, unlined road at the end of which lay the rear entrance to Menken's boatyard. I saw the little boy up ahead, standing in the middle of the road, staring down at the runnels of water and the odd patterns they made on the pavement. Grand, ever-changing geometric shapes molded by the surface's many idiosyncrasies. In the years when the carousel was absent from Starling Park, the legend of the spinning boy had changed somewhat. Because there was nothing for him to go around and around on anymore. The story had him running around in circles in the town's empty fields. I imagined him in the wide grass stretch behind Canterman Elementary. And the pancake, too. All alone as a blood-red sun clung to the early evening horizon behind him. Running around and around, arms outstretched, bathed in that sickly red light, running nowhere, never stopping until night came and simply took him. When the carousel reappeared, those stories were set aside for the most part. The mental image of the spinning boy in that field possessed me totally in that moment on Bell Street. So vivid that for the first time in years I got lost within myself. And for 10 or 15 seconds I was no longer standing on the street watching that child study the rainwater. I was gone. When I snapped back to full consciousness, the little boy was gone too. It's not inconceivable that such a thing can happen, my therapist had said. When you go back, you must think of Bonaparte as a kind of enclosed chamber with its own atmosphere and stimuli your system might not be prepared for. By the time I got back to my car, I was soaked and exhausted. From 2 to 2:30 I sat warming myself in a chain coffee house on Main Street, which had undergone a noticeable decline. Times were a little harder here in Bonaparte than I realized. Just as I was about to leave, Anton approached me. He was a pot-bellied man in his 50s, balding, British. He looked every bit the part of one of those tired English civil servants from a black-and-white movie, sitting at home with his biscuits, dressed like a college professor who had run out of money long ago, completely incongruous here in northern Florida. Sufferingly polite. He had overheard me talking to my new friend Nadine back at Walpole's Rummage, and admitted to following me into the cafe when he'd spotted me again by chance a half hour before. He wondered about my interest in the spinning boy. Was it a book I was writing? Was it a newspaper article? A film? I was vague. I just said it was none of those things. He sat down, a little handkerchief protruding from his shirt pocket, and said if my interest was truly genuine, he had something he could show me which would be very educational. Not a story, mind you, a tangible object related to the legend. He had been waiting to show this thing to someone for a very long time, and it felt like fate or coincidence had led me here. Not that he believed in such things, that was ridiculous. To really share something, real knowledge, that would please him. He was just an insurance adjuster, but had always been very driven by knowledge. He liked to read so much. He liked Russian literature. He liked books on early theater. He tried to smile a lot, to reassure me, I suppose, that he wasn't strange. He didn't look very well, rather pale. In his big, comfortable Plymouth, which was at least 20 years old, he drove me over to Alameda, about 4 miles away. Traffic was sparse. Some people were simply leaving town. The main road into the community was so waterlogged that we had to take a slightly different route. Anton had only lived in Florida for the first 14 years of his 55, and had then been called overseas to take care of a dying aunt who'd lived in Tottenham. And he had only returned 2 years before, to settle his father's meager estate. All the while, as he told me about his life, he was intentionally coy about what it was we were going to see. He hoped I didn't mind if he didn't divulge everything. He was afraid I'd be a little disappointed and maybe not want to come. He was grateful for the company, actually. I let him be whatever he felt like. I was patient. He had a lot of trash in the back seat of his car, fast food wrappers, that sort of thing. The house he lived in now was small, just one of many similar ones on Alva Street. Overgrown yards, chain-link fences bent and rusted. Few formal divisions between the properties, no community association lording over everyone. Roads where potholes were patched again and again. Roads that were going to be decimated by the rain. I turned down the offer of a soda and we went into the backyard, Anton carrying an enormous umbrella that would have sheltered us both. In the corner of the yard was what looked at first to me like a proper white shed, but I saw that its construction was far sturdier, and I realized it was a crypt. Unmarked, very modest, it could easily have been mistaken for one of those tiny houses rich people built for their kids to play in. It was only when you got close that you saw some of it was made of honest, speckled marble. His father had insisted it be built, Anton told me as we approached it. My father, he said, was a terrible man, you should know. Naturally, no one was actually buried here, and they never would be, zoning laws, of course. But the condition of leaving the house to his only son, Anton, was that some of his father's personal effects and those of Anton's mother, who died when he was only 2, be preserved there. Anton produced a silver key from his pocket and opened the wooden door, and we stepped inside, dry once again. When he closed the door behind us, there was only room for the 2 of us. No more. It was totally dark in there for 1 second before Anton reached up with pained breath and turned on a battery-powered light set into the ceiling. It threw a grim white glow down upon us. Set into the back wall of the crypt were 3 squares, each about 18 inches across, no markings. His father's effects were in the middle drawer, he told me, putting a hand on it. His mother's were in the one to the right. Anton himself had never opened them. The executor had taken care of all this. He apologized for the mystery, but confessed it was a bit exciting, somehow, to bring someone here to tell the story. His voice echoed in a tinny way inside the crypt. A terrible man, his father. Harsh. Anton had been secretly glad to go to England and never return. But even there, he said, the man's influence had been powerful. That man, whose name was Timothy, had been woken very late one night at the age of 11 by his own father, Anton's grandfather, who informed little Timothy that he just struck and killed a young boy who had suddenly run out in the middle of the road. This was in the year 1940. He needed his son's help tending to the body because in the impact of the crash, he'd mangled his hand. There was no question of going to the police, Anton told me. Neither my father nor my grandfather would ever have done that. And so there was the pressing issue of concealment. Anton gave me a strange smile that he seemed to consciously cut off before it fully developed, and he opened the leftmost drawer on the wall. Inside it was a wooden box, much longer than it was wide. Leaving it in the drawer, Anton opened the lid and pulled back the edges of a dark green towel. It had been used to wrap the skeleton of a child. The skeleton was no longer intact, and the bones and skull had been neatly arranged to conserve space inside the box. The rib cage was in 2 halves, one placed on top of the other. The skull's mouth was partly open. It had been hidden in 3 different places by his father since 1940, Anton told me, not revealing exactly where. and it had ended up here. The child had been struck on Graceville Road, 1 block away from Starling Park, right on the lake. It was likely but not definite that Anton's grandfather, who committed suicide in 1950, had been drinking. So perhaps this, Anton said, this is how it began? The story you're so interested in? I finally looked at him, his eyes seeming ancient and sunken under that sick, faintly buzzing light. I said, "Why do you keep this here?" And he said, "I told you my father was a very bad person, and not to be thwarted or disobeyed in any way. Anton didn't want to believe he'd be tortured by nightmares and unexplained sicknesses or ill fortune if he were to protest. But we all have our failings and weaknesses and what have you. No one is entirely rational," he said. "It's just a matter of the degree of interior chaos you can live with." He hoped that if I were to write about this, that I would keep his name out of it and the name of his family. But what wonderful background information, wouldn't I agree? What an amazing historical sequence ending today with my visit to the town and the first time he dared tell anyone about the drawer. He felt unburdened, finally, after so many years of silence, and was grateful that I listened to him, even if these bones perhaps had nothing to do with anything related to the spinning boy, which was certainly possible. Anton invited me in for sangria, which he liked to make sometimes, and to turn on the news to keep an eye on the forecast. But I told him I had to go. I had things to do. So he agreed to drive me back to my car at the shopping center. And as we drove and he fiddled with the radio, I thought, how terrible was your father, Anton? Bad enough to distort you, motherless Anton, caregiver to a dying aunt when you were way too young to manage it. I've read that sometimes people who do an awful thing wait for that supremely satisfying moment when they can reveal it in a sly way, but not get caught. Tell someone a tall tale and enjoy every second of the ruse. Anton shook my hand as I got out of the car, said it was awfully nice to meet me, but he did not say if I was ever back in town we should talk more. He did not ask for my address or my phone number, or even where I would be in a week, a month, a year. In another circumstance, maybe, I would have mused upon this man for hours. But I had something I needed to do. I could have driven to Starling Park to end my strange day in Bonaparte, but I chose to go on foot instead, and I carried no protection against the rain. I wanted to feel that rain. I wanted to feel the town around me as I'd felt it as a child, always out in the elements, out in whatever God set upon us. I must have looked deeply strange as I walked along, pathetic even, but I saw few people. To be out driving late that afternoon was a grim business, a chore. Only the main roads were navigable without frustration now. The surface of the lake beside Starling Park was choppy and gray. A few of the houses well behind me across Neoga Road had their lights on. Dusk was settling in, and those who were going to simply wait out the storm had hunkered down, wanting only for their electricity to stay on. I was completely alone. The bench I'd sat on sometimes after riding my bike all day was still there, dedicated to a townswoman who had passed away a couple of years before my family had taken me to another city to live. The playground was now enclosed by an 8-inch high wooden border, which contained the bark chips that comprised the ground. Some of those chips were actually floating in the standing water. I stepped forward and wiped the rain from my eyes. The sign that had for decades warned parents and children that the metal surface of the playground equipment could get so very hot was profoundly rusted around the edges, but still here. And that was so sad in a way, because the carousel was the only thing you could play on now that was made of metal. The new jungle gym was constructed from stout wood and plastic, specially tinted to reject the heat. But yes, the carousel, which had been returned to its original spot in 2004, was precisely the same. The 4 white horses with their green, blue, red and yellow hair and trim, one color each, those colors faded and chipped, stared silently. The structure was smaller than I even remembered, coming barely up to my waist. Not much had been done about the rust on the handles or the unforgiving flat surface where children had laid one knee sometimes as they first pushed themselves around before hopping up on a horse's back. Looking at the carousel, I could not imagine how a child could catch himself in these simple mechanisms. Could not imagine the position of a small body as the carousel got up too much speed, becoming suddenly dangerous. How could the burn or scar have happened, I thought, the one on the cheek that was in the story sometimes, and sometimes not. I reached out and touched the wet horse with the green trim, which would have been my personal favorite, I think. With my hand on its head, I looked up at the sky, the same sky Wanda Windows had found herself staring at upon waking from her mysterious fugue state long ago. The story had actually outlived her. I turned back to the warning sign, but it wasn't there anymore. It just wasn't there. Yes, that's because while the carousel had been restored, the sign had never been found. I'd imagined it. Every rust mark and flaw on it, every word. I looked up at the sound of an idling engine. Someone was standing at the driver's side door of a minivan, right about where Wanda Windows had seen the spinning boy approaching in his funeral suit. A woman, sensibly holding a red umbrella, was watching me from the curb, 20 yards away. She was asking me if I needed a lift or just to get out of the rain. I splashed out of the playground and left the park. She was just a helpful neighbor with a sleeping 2-year-old in the back seat and a bumper sticker from Glass Manor Presbyterian on Main Street. She'd seen me standing there getting drenched and didn't want to see anyone get pneumonia. She was on her way home to her husband and 2 other kids after her volunteer evening at the local rec center had been cut short by the storm. She began to drive me back to my car at the shopping center. After only 10 or 12 sentences of small talk, she asked me if I knew what had happened at that carousel way back when. About the ghost with the mark of a demon on his cheek, cursed to ride the red horse forever and ever because he lied and lied and lied to his parents. And here is what I told her. Yeah, I know about the spinning boy. See, when I was 8 years old, I sleepwalked a lot. It terrified my parents. And once I made it all the way to Starling Park. I don't remember much, but I think I got the carousel going pretty fast, and I got suspended between sleeping and waking, and I panicked, and I began to scream my head off. It felt like it had me, like I was being dragged around and around. But I made it off, and some nice stranger like you put me into their car, took me home. She was a nurse, I think. And somehow this town needed or craved something of its own to imagine and believe in. Because it wasn't even a year after that night that I heard about the legend. I felt so ashamed, ashamed that people were associating me with something so dark. I never said a word to anyone. My parents could have set it straight. But they didn't. I never understood why, unless they realized that a story is always more powerful than the truth. So they just took me away from here. Every year that went by, I was the spinning boy, more and more, no matter how far away I lived. But now, I told her, after going through all my notes of the past years and after spending the day here and listening to the townspeople, I think that maybe I've been wrong for almost 4 decades. Maybe the legend of the spinning boy began sometime after 1979, but the facts which had seeded it were planted somehow before that and needed a generation, 2 generations, 3 to take hold. Maybe I've been wrong, and he was someone else, and he was real. The kindly woman who had stopped for me was no longer driving us forward. We were simply idling at a stop sign on Kipling Street. Now the look on her face was one of such horror. I'd never seen the likes of it before. "Don't you know?" she said in a tiny voice. "What happens if you steal the identity of someone who has departed, especially a child?" "No," I said to her. "What happens?" "Well," she said, "the ghost gets angry. That's all I know. It gets angry." I was drunk when I returned to Ivy Lock Bed and Breakfast at midnight and let myself in the back door. In the hours since sunset, the storm had dissipated almost entirely, but it seemed that the house had lost its power. No lights in any of the windows, so thankfully I was spared the vision of the mannequin known as Miriam, gazing out the upstairs sitting room in perfect silhouette. Everything was dark. I maneuvered uneasily down the main hallway and climbed the creaky stairs. Stumbled on 2 of them. At the top, I stared down the long corridor toward the sitting room, where the ladies lived behind a closed door. And a child was standing there, in the shadows, facing me. His bare legs were visible in a shaft of moonlight, but his upper body was in darkness. My mouth opened to say something. I didn't feel in control of what. And only one word came out, and that word was, "Please." So soft and frail that it was certainly never even heard. The child stepped forward. Little socks snug on dry feet. And it wasn't a boy at all. It was a little girl. She looked at me inquisitively. She said hello. I was not the only guest at the B&B now. Her name was Irina, and her mother and father had come over to stay the night because their basement was flooded. They were here a lot, she told me. They only lived right around the corner. "Late to stay up," I said, and she told me proudly that it was super ordinary for her, but I shouldn't tell her mom and dad that she'd left her room. And of course I asked her what I should not have, but like I said, I was drunk. "Oh, sure," she said. "I know the spinning boy. He lives here." I remembered David's cutesy but cynical marketing ploy of the haunted spinning wheel. Without waiting for a response from me, Irina grabbed my right hand and pulled me down the hallway to show me. She opened the door to the sitting room, obviously having visited this place many times. Inside, I expected her to gesture to Miriam and the wheel, but instead, she pointed toward the dormant fireplace at Judy. She told me that the spinning boy lived under Judy's big metal hoop skirt, the one David had pointed out. Judy wore it as best she could, half bent over, an iron poker in her hand that hadn't moved for decades, resting several inches short of the ashless fireplace. Irina said she saw him under there just tonight. But he'd been very mean to her, and she'd run away. What did he say? I asked. But according to Irina, he never ever said words. He'd never been mean before. But that was okay with her because she didn't have to stay here if she didn't want to. And with that, she padded back down the corridor and took a left turn into her room across from her parents. I stayed there in the sitting room just a little while longer. I imagined the firelight spreading orange and red over Judy's eyeless face on a freezing winter night which would never truly come. The hoop skirt had no pattern, no true color. It could not shift in a random draft, could not become wrinkled, and no small child could ever fit under the half-inch gap between its hem and the carpet beneath it. My watch told me it was 12:41 when I left the room. 4:19. I woke up in my bed. I was sweating. I sensed a presence near me, very close, on my right side. Someone standing near the bed. I felt him. Don't open your eyes, I told myself. Don't open your eyes. Don't look at him. That would be the end of you. I heard a tiny movement, the scraping of one small shoe on the wooden floor. One step closer to the bed. I prepared to arch my back and scream as loud as I could to see if I could scream so that all of Bonaparte could hear me. Something stretched outward toward me very fast. I felt the disturbance of the air as it came close, and then pressure on my right cheek, skin against skin, warm and soft. And before I could jerk away, the fingers there pressed down harder, and there was a hot pain so intense that the sound that leapt from my mouth was like a siren, a wailing shriek. I sprung up, blubbering, staggering off the bed, as the pain's second wave struck me. I threw back my bedroom door and tore down the hall. Already my tears were falling to the floorboards. Into the sitting room I ran, where I knew there was a big wall mirror. I fumbled for the wall switch and struck it. The power having been restored, the lights came on. Weeping, I pulled my right hand away from my cheek to reveal the ugly red and black burn that was growing and darkening even now, while behind me came Irina and Irina's parents and David and his wife Deborah, all of whom noticed before I did that the fireplace poker was gone, no longer fixed in Judy's right hand. It was found on the floor back in my bedroom 10 minutes later, its end still smoking, though the fireplace was empty and dormant, as it had been for the last 20 years. And under Judy's metal hoop skirt, how the spinning boy must have grinned and grinned, no longer feeling so angry that everything around him seemed dark and without hope.